There's a question that haunts the quiet moments of your life. You don't ask it often. You've learned to drown it out with noise, with work, with scrolling, with the endless maintenance of a life that looks fine from the outside. But it's still there, waiting. Who am I beneath the version of myself I've learned to perform? Think about it. You have a voice you use with your colleagues, a different one with your family, another one with strangers. There's the version of you that posts on social media, and the version that exists in the dark when no one's watching. They're not the same person. They can't be. So which one is real? Here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of us have spent so long adapting, performing, and pleasing that we've lost access to the answer. We've become so good at being who we're supposed to be that we no longer know who we actually are. And that loss, that quiet disconnection from yourself, is the source of more suffering than you've probably allowed yourself to feel. This isn't going to be a video about becoming someone new. It's about something harder and more valuable. It's about reclaiming the person you forgot you were. Part 1. The struggle. Let's name what's actually happening. You wake up, you check your phone, you move through a series of obligations. You eat when you're not hungry. You scroll when you're bored. You laugh when nothing's funny. You say, "I'm fine," when you're not. You fall asleep exhausted but not fulfilled. And somewhere in the background, a quiet voice whispers, "There has to be more than this." But you don't listen, because listening would mean something has to change. And change is terrifying. Here's what psychologists have observed about this state. It's not depression necessarily, it's not anxiety. It's something more subtle and more pervasive. It's called alienation from self, a condition where the persona you present to the world and your authentic inner experience have drifted so far apart that you no longer feel real. You feel like you're watching yourself live rather than actually living. This happens slowly. It's not a dramatic betrayal. It's 1,000 small compromises. You laughed at a joke you didn't find funny to fit in. You stayed quiet when you had something to say to avoid conflict. You pursued a path that looked impressive but felt empty because it earned approval. You abandoned parts of yourself, your weird humor, your strange interests, your unfashionable passions, because somewhere along the way you learned they weren't acceptable. And now those parts are ghosts. They haunt you in moments of quiet. They show up in dreams. They surface when you drink. They whisper in the space between sleeping and waking. You left me behind. Most people spend their whole lives running from those ghosts. They keep busy. They keep achieving. They keep accumulating. But no amount of external success can fill an internal absence. The reason you feel stuck isn't that you lack direction. It's that you lack integration. You're fragmented, and fragmentation always feels like something's missing, because something is. Part 2. The hidden mechanism. To understand why this happens, we have to look at something developmental psychologists call adaptive self-structure. Here's what that means in plain language. When you were a child, you were completely dependent on the adults around you for survival. Not just physically, emotionally too. Your sense of safety, belonging, and worth came from them. And children are brilliant observers. They figure out very quickly what behaviors earn love and what behaviors risk rejection. So you learned. Maybe you learned that being quiet kept you safe. Maybe you learned that achieving things earned approval. Maybe you learned that taking care of others' emotions made you needed. Maybe you learned that hiding your anger, your sadness, or your fear was the price of acceptance. None of this was conscious. You weren't sitting there strategizing. You were just surviving. And those survival strategies worked. They got you through. No. But here's the problem that haunts adulthood. Those strategies never left. They became automated. They became your personality. They became the voice in your head that tells you what you should do, what you should feel, who you should be. Psychologists call this the introject, the internalized voice of external expectations. And the tragedy is, you started believing that voice was you. So now, 30 years later, you're still performing the strategies of a child trying to be loved. You're still hiding parts of yourself that were once deemed unacceptable. You're still seeking approval from people whose opinions don't matter, because the original need, the childhood need, was never fully met and never fully healed. This is why you can achieve everything and feel nothing. This is why you can be surrounded by people and feel alone. This is why you can tick every box and still feel empty. The person being applauded isn't the real you. It's the adaptive self, the performer, the mask. And masks get heavy when you wear them too long. Part 3. A research finding. There's a study from Harvard psychologist Robert Kegan that illuminates this beautifully. Kegan spent decades studying adult development, and he found something counterintuitive. Most people assume that growth is about adding things, more skills, more knowledge, more confidence. But Kegan discovered that genuine psychological growth is actually about subtraction. It's about outgrowing the assumptions that once held us together. He describes it as moving from being subject to something to being objective about it. Here's what that means. When you're subject to a belief, you can't see it. It's just reality. It's the water you swim in. For example, if you grew up believing that your worth depends on achievement, you don't think, "I believe this." You just feel worthless when you're not producing. The belief is invisible. It's running you from behind the scenes. But when you become objective about that belief, you can see it. You can examine it. You can question whether it's actually true or just an old tape that's been playing since childhood. This is what transformation actually is. It's the process of taking beliefs you once were and turning them into beliefs you have. It's the difference between being a character in a story and being the author of it. Kegan's research showed that most adults never make this shift. They remain subject to the assumptions they absorbed in childhood. They live inside stories they didn't write, believing the walls of their minds are the edges of reality. But here's the hopeful part. The capacity for this shift never goes away. The brain remains plastic. Awareness remains possible. You can, at any age, start to see the water you've been swimming in. And the moment you see it, something shifts. You realize the cage was never locked. You just thought it was. Part 4. An unexpected concept. This leads to a concept that might sound strange at first, but stay with me. The self you're trying to find isn't hidden inside you, it's hidden behind you. Most of our psychological models are spatial. We talk about inner work and going deeper and finding yourself. But what if the self isn't something you dig for? What if it's something you uncover by removing what's been placed on top of it? Think of it like this. Imagine a statue covered in layers of plaster. Someone painted over it again and again for decades. If you want to see the original sculpture, you don't go looking for it somewhere else. You don't travel to find it. You don't dig a hole to reach it. You just start removing the layers. This is what the mystics meant when they talked about via negativa, the path of subtraction. And it's what certain schools of therapy mean when they talk about uncovering rather than constructing. The person you're trying to become isn't in the future. They're in the past, buried, waiting. Here's the counterintuitive implication. You don't need to build a new self. You need to stop maintaining the old one. Every time you people please, you're adding another layer. Every time you suppress anger to keep the peace, another layer. Every time you perform confidence when you feel terrified, another layer. These aren't bad strategies in the moment. They got you through, but they accumulate. And eventually, the original sculpture is unrecognizable. The work of transformation isn't creation, it's excavation. You're not becoming someone new. You're returning to someone old. Someone you were before you learned that certain parts of you weren't acceptable. Someone who laughed without checking if it was appropriate. someone who created without worrying if it was good, someone who loved without calculating the risk. That person isn't dead, they're just buried, and they're waiting. Part 5. A concrete example. Let me give you a real example so this isn't abstract. I once worked with someone, let's call her Sarah, who came to therapy because she felt empty despite external success. She had the career, the relationship, the apartment. On paper, everything worked. But inside, she felt like she was performing a role rather than living a life. As we talked, a pattern emerged. Sarah had grown up with a volatile parent. The parent's mood could shift instantly, and Sarah learned early that her safety depended on managing that mood. She became hypervigilant. She learned to read micro-expressions. She learned to suppress her own needs to keep the peace. She learned that being good meant being invisible. These strategies saved her as a child. They kept her safe. They worked. But 30 years later, Sarah was still running the same software. In every relationship, she monitored the other person's mood. In every job, she suppressed her own opinions to avoid conflict. In every social situation, she performed the version of herself that would cause the least friction. And she wondered why she felt empty. Of course, she felt empty. The real Sarah, the one with opinions, needs, and feelings, hadn't been consulted in decades. The work wasn't about teaching Sarah to be confident. It was about giving her permission to uncover the confidence that was already there, buried under layers of survival strategies. It was about helping her see that the vigilance keeping her safe was now keeping her trapped. When she finally expressed a genuine preference, something small like where to eat, she cried. Not because it mattered, because it was real. Because for the first time in years, the person speaking and the person inside were aligned. That alignment? That's what we're all starving for. You have your own version of this. Maybe it's not a volatile parent. Maybe it's something else. But there are parts of you that learn to hide, and they're still hiding, and they're still waiting. Part 6. The turning point. So here's the turning point, the insight that changes everything. You don't need to fix yourself. You need to stop editing yourself. Most self-improvement is actually self-suppression in disguise. You identify a part of yourself that feels unacceptable, your anger, your sadness, your desire, your fear, and you try to transform it into something more palatable. You try to turn your anger into assertiveness, your sadness into gratitude, your fear into courage. But here's what the depth psychologists understood that the self-help industry forgot. Those feelings aren't problems to be solved. They're messengers. They're carrying information. Your anger is telling you that a boundary has been crossed. Your sadness is telling you that something you loved has been lost. Your fear is telling you that you're moving towards something important. Your desire is telling you what you actually want, beneath what you've been told to want. When you suppress these messengers, you don't just lose the feeling. You lose the information. You lose access to your own inner guidance system. This is why people who seem to have everything can feel so lost. They've suppressed the signals so effectively that they no longer know what they actually want. They know what they should want. They know what looks good. They know what earns approval. But the quiet voice of authentic desire? It's been silenced so long it's barely a whisper. The turning point comes when you stop trying to change what you feel and start listening to what it's telling you. Not acting on every impulse, not being ruled by emotion, just listening, just receiving the information, just letting the messenger speak before you decide what to do with the message. This is what the research on emotional regulation actually shows. Suppression doesn't work. It backfires. What works is processing, letting the feeling exist, extracting its information, and then choosing your response consciously rather than reacting automatically. When you start doing this, something remarkable happens. The feelings that once seemed overwhelming become manageable. The parts of yourself you once rejected become allies. The inner conflict that drained your energy starts to settle. Not because you won, because you listened. Part 7. A fresh metaphor. Here's a metaphor to hold on to. Think of yourself as a radio. For years, you've been trying to tune into a station you can barely hear. You've been adjusting the antenna, buying better equipment, blaming the reception. But the problem isn't the equipment. The problem is that you're tuned to the wrong frequency. You've been tuned to the frequency of expectation, the frequency of approval, the frequency of should. And that frequency is mostly static. Occasionally you get a clear signal, a moment of genuine connection, a flash of real joy, a surge of authentic anger, but mostly it's noise. The frequency you're looking for is quieter. It doesn't broadcast at maximum volume. It whispers. It speaks in hunches and gut feelings and inexplicable attractions. It doesn't sound like a commanding voice. It sounds like a subtle pull towards something you can't quite name. Most people never tune to that frequency because they're afraid of what they'll hear. What if it tells you to leave the relationship? What if it tells you to quit the job? What if it tells you that everything you've built is misaligned? But here's what the whispers know that the shouts don't. Alignment is more valuable than achievement. You can achieve everything and feel nothing. Or you can align with yourself and feel everything. The pain, the joy, the grief, the love, and know deep down that you're finally real. The radio doesn't need fixing, it needs retuning, and you're the only one who can turn the dial. Part 8. A practical shift. So how do you actually do this? How do you start turning the dial? Not with a 10-step plan, not with a morning routine, with something simpler and harder. You start by noticing the gap. Here's the practice. For one day, just one. Pay attention to the moments when you feel a slight resistance to being yourself. When you're about to laugh, but you check yourself. When you have an opinion, but you swallow it. When you feel sad, but you force a smile. When you want to say no, but you say yes. Just notice. Don't change anything. Don't judge yourself. Just observe. What you're doing in those moments is creating space. Space between the stimulus and the response. Space between the old program and the potential new choice. And in that space, something shifts. The automatic becomes visible. And what becomes visible can eventually become optional. The second practice is harder. It's about experimenting with authenticity. Pick a low-stakes situation, a conversation with a stranger, an interaction with a cashier, a moment with a friend where nothing important hangs in the balance. And in that moment, try something different. Say what you actually think. Express what you actually feel. Let the mask slip just a little. Notice what happens. Probably nothing catastrophic. Probably just a flicker of something unfamiliar, a feeling of being slightly more real than you were a moment before. That flicker is important. It's a signal. It's the buried self saying, "I'm still here. Thank you for letting me out." These experiments accumulate. They rewire the neural pathways that have kept you performing. They show your nervous system that authenticity is safe. They prove, in small doses, that you can survive being seen. And eventually, the experiments stop being experiments. They become a new way of living. The closing. There's a reason you made it to the end of this. Not because the ideas were new, not because the metaphors were clever, because something in you recognized itself. Something in you has been waiting for permission to stop performing. Something in you remembers a time before the mask, before the compromise, before the layers of plaster obscured the sculpture. That something is not lost. It's not broken. It's not gone. It's just buried. And burial is not death. Burial is waiting. The person you're trying to become is not in the future. They're in the past. They're the version of you that existed before you learned that certain parts weren't acceptable, before you learned to hide, before you learned to perform, before you learned that love was conditional and safety required camouflage. That person is still there, buried under years of adaptation, yes. Covered in layers of survival strategies, absolutely, but alive. Waiting, hoping you'll finally stop adding layers and start removing them. The work of transformation is not construction, it's excavation. It's not becoming, it's returning. You don't need to fix yourself, you need to find yourself. And the finding doesn't require a journey outward, it requires a journey backward. Through the layers, through the adaptations, through the performances. Back to the place where you stopped being real and started being safe. It's scary to go back there. I won't pretend it isn't. There's a reason you left those parts behind. They were vulnerable, they were soft, they were easily hurt, but they were also you. And without them, you're just a collection of strategies pretending to be a person. So here's the closing thought, the only question that actually matters. Are you willing to be seen? Not the performed version, not the edited version, not the version that fits in, the real one, the buried one, the one that laughs too loud and cries too easily and wants things that don't make sense on paper. Because that version is still there, buried but breathing, hidden but waiting, and they're not asking you to become someone new. They're asking you to come home. Ciao. The excavation starts now. Stop performing. Start returning.